I don't know about you, but there are moments when the only reason I don't run a lap around this church is because I'm Baptist. Sounds like there's a few of you with me this morning on that. What is it about stories of seemingly ordinary people doing heroic events or heroic things that captivates us? We've all seen it on the news stories. Somebody at the right place at the right time, just an everyday person, stands in the gap and does something heroic. And those stories have a way of captivating us, don't they? But why is that? Well, I think there's something in all of us. There's an innate desire that our life would be significant, that we would make an impact, that we would matter. So we're drawn in. But sadly, most of us have been taught and we've adopted the mentality that quiet, faithful, ordinary people aren't heroes. We've just thought of them as being boring. We've adopted the world's understanding of life. However, when our knowledge of God is expanded, when our understanding of His person and character is expanded and based on the Scripture, we discover that God is always the hero. And in realizing that, in recognizing that God is always the hero, we will find significance in the seemingly ordinary or mundane events in our life because we know He has strategically and providentially placed us right where we are. And when God's placed you somewhere, there's absolutely nothing boring about your existence. When our understanding of God's person and character, knowing that He's intimately involved in the details of our lives, we begin to realize that there's something beautiful, there's something godly about living a faithful and quiet life for the Lord. In fact, when I think about my heroes in the faith, now I understand that some of you love when we see celebrities who acknowledge Christ or call upon His name, and you celebrate that. But I'm still thankful for the faithful VBS workers. They're still my heroes. I'm still grateful for the children's church and the nursery workers who stand in the gap. I am still grateful for the heroes of the faith whose names will never be mentioned and never remembered, but their names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And knowing that, we know who the true hero is. When we look at their lives, we recognize that Jesus is always the hero, that God is always the hero of every single story. But as we think about our lives, as we heard in our call to worship, that God chooses the weak to confound the strong. He chooses the foolish to confound the wise, the seemingly nobodies to confound the so-called somebodies. We're reminded that God chooses and uses unlikely people. In fact, God specializes in choosing ordinary people. Oh, isn't that just like you, Lord? What does Paul say to the Corinthian church? So that no one could boast. Oh, we live in a world of non-stop boasting. The bombastic praises that are heaped on those who are unworthy and undeserving, while we ignore just the average, everyday, godly man or woman who stands in the trenches, working hard, taking care of their families, and loving the Lord. But when you know you've been providentially placed, you're not preoccupied with becoming the hero. You become consumed with proclaiming who the true hero of your life and the life of all the redeemed is. And that's why when we come to the book of Esther, we don't look at it simply in isolation, though we study it in its context. We understand and we read all of the Bible through this lens. We put these glasses on, and those glasses are the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So when we could say that although God's name is not mentioned, His hand is evident, we recognize that that same hand that was moving human history to deliver God's people is still providentially placing people in key places. Now, if you were to watch the news, you'd never think so. If you were to watch the news like some of you are, you would only buy shotgun shells and seeds. We'd never see you again. You'd be off in the woods. Some of you are doing that right now and in process, and I know you are. Stop watching the news. But anyway, and then give me the address so that if I've got to bug out, I can get there. You're preoccupied, though, with the wrong message. When we come back to Scripture, we discover that God has providentially placed His people. But I want you to note in our story, there's something interesting that's going to happen here in this story. God providentially places Esther and Mordecai to save the Persian king's life. And many of us would think it would have been better off had they not saved his life. It seems strange as we hear the story unfolding, but what we'll recognize is that placement in saving the king's life ultimately moves us to a place where God will use them to save His people. In fact, the key verse in the book of Esther is not the famous verse for such a time as this. That's not the key. That's not the center. That's not the emphasis. In fact, the emphasis is in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. That's why I've placed them at the beginning of your study guide, so that you would see that. Because what we're going to see here today is some strange and peculiar things are happening. But then we recognize that God was still in absolute, complete control. So as we look at the text here, I want us to consider God's divine providence in the first 4 verses. Notice in verse 4 that King Ahasuerus believes that he's in control of his destiny, that all of his desires and will be met whenever he says it. He says, that suits me, fine. Take from those, bring to me. But notice his will is always to take. It's always to feed his temporal desires. And so we see God's divine providence here, but let's take a step back and let's look at the text afresh. Because you know the end of the story, do you not? If you don't, hang in there. We'll tell you. God's people are delivered. In fact, that's the end of every story we're going to tell you. God's people will be delivered. That's the end of history. God's people will be delivered. So I'm going to tell you, it's always a happy ending. God's people will be delivered by God. So that's how it's going to turn out. But let's take a step back. Now think about this. You're hearing about how God delivered His people. A prophet or preacher is announcing God's deliverance. And you're hearing about this great king. Then you see he's not really that great. And then you hear about a beauty pageant. A beauty pageant? What's going on? I mean, this is the most unlikely event. I mean, God, I expect you. I'm like the disciples. When will you rain down fire on New York? But anyway, I move on. And so, I don't know how this stuff gets in my notes. Jamie? I'm like the disciples, though. I want to see God work in the way I think He should work. And there's this beauty pageant. And of all things, this is the most unlikely place to think that God is working. But isn't that just like you, Lord? See, what we don't realize, what happens during this time, so King Ahasuerus says, yes, this is my will, this should happen. And then if you notice, when you jump over, just look real quick, over at verse 16, we hear in the 7th year of his reign. There's a 4-year gap from verse 4 to verse 17. What happens in those 4 years, I think it's important to know. It helps us understand the psychology, if you will, of a psychopath potentate. That is this, he goes off to war with the Greeks and loses and nearly empties pretty much most of the wealth that he had. So he comes back after 4 years and decides to pick back up his promiscuity. But we find God working in a most unlikely place. This should be a reminder for you because you're thinking today, if you knew my life, if you knew how boring my life was and how seemingly insignificant I feel at times, and I would just say this, I don't start with you. I don't start with you. I start with God. When you say that to me, my answer to you is, have you thought about the person and character of God? Because when you know more about God, the more you will realize that there is nothing ordinary about your existence. The very fact that you stand here redeemed and saved by Christ removes any doubt in my mind if you were just ordinary or boring. You are an object of divine grace. You are a masterpiece that He continues to weave together to this very day. But notice I didn't start with you. I started with God. The more you know about Him, the more you will realize that He's working in these unlikely places through unworthy people to bring about His perfect will. So certainly this was more than a beauty contest. And so we might ask the question then, it seems strange when we look at the text, how did we get here? What are we doing here? What are the Jews doing in Persia at this time? What are God's people even doing there? The author inserts this in the introduction of Mordecai. Oh, by the way, God's divine judgment rests upon His people. Now, it becomes even more peculiar in my mind at this point. We went from there is a beauty pageant to, oh, hey, by the way, the people are in exile. Now, in the mind of a person in the ancient Near East, a god was limited by certain geographical boundaries. We do that all the time, don't we, with God? We limit Him. We carve out this parameter in which He can work, whether it's time or geography, and we say, here's your limitations, God. They always fit my understanding of you, but if my understanding was to be expanded, maybe my concept of where God and when God can work would change. We try to limit Him. We find it even more peculiar now. Not only do we find of the strangest events in world history, the author brings us to a wretched king's palace for a beauty contest so he can choose his next wife, and then we find out, by the way, the people of God are there because of divine judgment. They're under judgment. Of all the places and all the times we'd expect God to take a step back and say, this is what you wanted. Up to this point in biblical history, that's all we see. This is what they wanted. They had pursued other gods. They had pursued other nations. God has handed them over. We'd expect Him just to take a step back, but yet He doesn't. Think about that. Because you've adopted in your mind some form of legalism, you have this concept that you've done something that somehow would remove God's grace from your life or somehow limit His grace or His affection towards you. You've been taught if you don't follow a checklist of things that somehow God is disappointed in you. That if you don't go to the left or the right, that somehow you'll give an account before God. But I want to remind you that when I stand before God and when you stand before God, we stand clothed in the righteousness of Christ. We are covered in His blood. We will stand there declared not guilty only because of Jesus Christ. And so what we see here, and this is a beautiful picture of the cross, as we are propelling towards it, we see in the midst of judgment there is salvation. Isn't that what the cross is? Isn't that judgment on humanity? Isn't He taking upon Himself our sin? At that very moment on the cross, we see grace, but it comes through salvation. In the midst of judgment, this is how God has always worked. In fact, we see it all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, do we not? That it would be through the crushing of the head of the serpent that salvation would come. That is, that there would be judgment and salvation running in tandem. So we hear here that Mordecai's ancestors had come through the exile. Now some would suggest maybe Mordecai did, but that would place him well over 100 years from now. And so it's easy to read the scope as the generations here are telescoped for us so that we understand who he is. And the fact that he's a Benjaminite, just keep that in the back of your mind. Make a note. That'll come up later as we'll see this conflict between him and Haman coming up. Because we'll discover that Mordecai, like Saul, is a descendant of Benjamin. That will come in later. Just make a note of it. So how did we end up here? Well, they ended up here because of their sin. And I want you to know, I want you to hear this thread that runs through the story and runs through the Bible. Sin may have brought them there, but it was God's grace that would save them from there. And that is exactly true for our lives today. That's true for our nation. Sin may have brought us to this point, but it is divine grace that will save us from it. That is and remains our only hope. That hasn't changed, and it won't change 10 days from now. Our hope remains that God, by His grace, will save our nation, that He will save His people. And the only way this nation will be saved is if revival spreads across this nation. Listen, stop putting your hope in majorities and minorities, speakers and whips, the executive and the judiciary, and place your hope in a God who, although sin brought us here, He will save us from here. That's what we see. That's why we study these books of the Bible, because God hasn't changed. God remains the same. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Nothing has changed. But let us move on as we see this unlikely candidate for queen. Did you notice that Esther is mentioned by also her Hebrew name? She gets her Hebrew name and her Persian name. Hadassah is her Hebrew name. And then her Persian name basically is a version of Ishtar, which was just a Persian goddess. We see a tension here. I think the author's setting us up when he introduces her, is he not? He's showing us there's a tension here. She's truly a woman with two identities, is she not? In fact, the narrator goes out of the way here to show us twice in verse 10 of chapter 2 and also in verse 20 that Esther had not made known her kindred or people. Now, some of us want to elevate Esther to a hero. And what we're going to see here is the author is weaving together these tensions that you will understand as you read the story with fresh eyes. You will see that there's some things that aren't really that good about Esther. There's some things that aren't really that good about Mordecai. In fact, there's so many things that make her an unlikely candidate. She's living in tension, and in some ways she illustrates God's people trying to live in a secular culture. She's a woman with two identities. She's torn. Is she not? She's pulled. She's torn. And some might even point out, and I think rightfully so, she appears to at times compromise her identity. Isn't it strange, the people that God uses? You say, I never could be an Esther. I don't know that I would want to be. I could never be a Mordecai. I don't know that I would want to be. Analyzing their lives, looking at it, I don't know that I would want to be them. And so in many respects, we may be better positioned because the author of Hebrews says that they were looking for the promises, but they weren't complete yet. They found their completion in us and what Christ did for us. That's what we read in that great hall of faith. As he concludes that they were lacking something. They were still missing, still longing, still looking to something better, something perfect. That is Christ himself. Certainly she's an unlikely candidate, but she finds divine favor. She's somewhat like a Daniel type, is she not? She continues to be propelled by God's favor. But I think it's interesting as we see her here that we recognize that those whom God chooses to use, they don't necessarily meet our prerequisites, do they? Are we shocked? Well, we've read the story so many times anymore, we're not shocked. We're like, of course, Esther. Of course, somebody who's hiding their identity. Of course, someone who's not telling the world who she is. Of course, she's the ideal candidate. And then we stand up here from the stage and say, proclaim who you are in Christ. Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid. She's not a likely candidate at all. There's nothing about her, spiritually speaking. But then we get some indicators that she was beautiful, and that her beauty attracted the human king. I want you to see something, though, that's happening here. Because it's not really her beauty that's at the forefront. It's a historical point. She's actually being contrasted with Vashti. Because notice it says she doesn't need the cosmetics. She doesn't need all the dressings of the world. Vashti, whose name means the desired one, is now being contrasted with the chosen one. There is a clear distinction, a clear difference here, as you will see contrasting running throughout the book. It starts out with a contrasting between Yahweh and Ahasuerus. Now we see the contrasting between Vashti and Esther, and we'll see it continue between Mordecai and Haman. And ultimately, the message that's running through here, even though the thread is so subtle, it is that there is a difference between those whom God's grace and favor rest upon and the rest of the world. It's evident not necessarily in their physical beauty. It's not necessarily evident in their spirituality, but it's evident in God's hand being upon them. You can't explain to me favor. I don't understand it, but I know it when I see it. When God's hand rests upon somebody, something's happening in their life that they couldn't muster up, that they couldn't do in of themselves. But the Lord Almighty has placed His hand upon them, unlikely and unworthy as they may be. His hand rests upon them, and He's using them to do His will and His work. And I love the fact that we can't always explain it. Because if you could explain it, that means that you could nail it down, you could replicate it, but you can't replicate the favor of God. You cannot. That's why it's grace. That's why we seek it, we long for it, we love it as He lavishes it upon us. Who would have thought that Jesus would have died for me? You say, I know they would have. You don't know my heart. The heart is deceitful and wicked above all things. Who could know it? And yet God died for me. I am the most unlikely child that He could have ever adopted. But yet we see His grace. And Jesus is nothing like Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus goes out into the world and he seeks the most beautiful and he takes from the world the most beautiful. And let me tell you how Jesus finds His bride. He goes into the world and He looks for the wretched and the spiritually ugly and the depraved, and He makes them beautiful. Oh, how good is Jesus this morning when we see the way He searches for His bride. And He doesn't delegate it to someone else. He does it Himself. That's a beautiful picture. You say, how is Jesus the hero of this story? Because I don't read this story in isolation. I read it in redemptive history because I know there was coming a day when the groom would seek out his bride and says, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Not because they were already attractive or they already had merit or goodness, but because of how good He is. That's why it's blessed to be invited, because He goes out and finds the ugly, the wretched, the nobodies, the nothings, and makes them beautiful. We show up in tattered, wretched clothing, and He clothes us in a white robe of righteousness. It is Christ that beautifies His church. We don't need all the trappings of the world. He sees us for who we are, and yet He still loves us. Oh, we are the unlikely ones, are we not? But let us move on to Mordecai. It's strange that Mordecai is now a fairly common Jewish name. Up to this point wasn't. It's simply a name, a derivative from a false Persian god, Marduk. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but it would be fair to say that Marduk would be admonished and celebrated and worshipped here in America today. He required the killing of babies for sacrifice at his altar, and so we can recognize that there would be millions who would celebrate and worship him. They do so under a different name. It's strange that he's named after such a god, but we do see that in Daniel and his companions also received foreign names. And what you want to note here, and I'm just going to give you this as a side note, this is the attempt of the devil through a secular government to indoctrinate people and change their identity. Oh, that's still happening today. Oh, that's still happening. There's nothing new under the sun. Why do you think they want to get into our educational systems and begin to teach children very, very young that they're not a boy, that they're not a girl, that there's no God? Nothing new under the sun. This is still the evil one trying to manipulate and coerce. But he's still not been able to stamp out the gospel. You want to know why he can't stamp out the gospel and he can't kill the church? Because when you get a group of people that realize how unlikely and unworthy they were and they recognize how great God is, you can't make them shut up. They just won't, and we won't. So we find here Mordecai the magistrate. Now, when you read the text, you may have glossed over this, but more than likely Mordecai is appointed after Esther becomes queen. The text doesn't directly say it, but appears within the chronology that he's elevated to a position. He sits at the king's gate. That doesn't mean he's just out there hanging out. That's his spot. He's got a chair. He's on the porch, and he's whittling wood. That is not what that means. It means that he's a magistrate, an official in the king's court. I think what we've had here now, Esther, the queen, Mordecai as a magistrate. But this is strange to me, because I'm asking the question, she chooses Mordecai to be a magistrate. Who chose her to be queen? Well, you read the text, did you not? You heard it read. Ahasuerus chose her to be queen. Did he not? We find now one of those places in the Bible where these two beautiful truths come together. Where we see on the one hand divine sovereignty, and on the other we see human choice. And they work perfectly in tandem. And we see truly how in control God really is. Because ultimately it is God who chooses Esther. We know that. But he is able to work through human activity to such a degree that we would find in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. What men mean for evil, God means for good. And in that text, he goes on to say, to save many people. That's how amazing God is. That he's appointing, choosing, and placing people in strategic positions. Why? To save people. He's always been and always will be in the saving business. You have the job that you have. You live in the community that you reside in for God's purposes. I understand what may have propelled you there may have been the evil activity of your own heart or someone else. But God is in the position and in the business of redeeming people. And as he's redeeming people, he's using them in those places to see people's lives saved. But as I say that, you wouldn't expect God to place you somewhere to save the life, the physical life of someone so wretched and so unworthy. I mean, we've all sized people up before. You've never done that? You've never sized someone up before? You walk by, kind of get an idea. Do you remember being in high school? Walking through the cafeteria? There were certain tables that you could sit at, certain tables you can't sit at. Do you remember? Some of you are like, it's been so long ago, preacher. It's been 225 years ago. Okay, Methuselah. Okay, I get for some of you, maybe it's hard to remember, but you remember. You go through, you're trying to navigate life. You're trying to figure things out. But I want you to know that wherever you are, it doesn't matter if you're at the cool kids table, the nerd table, the jock table. I don't remember all the tables, but there was a bunch of them. God can still use you right where you are. God is using you today and you don't even know it. You're too preoccupied. Step back and think about how God is using you. He's no respecter of persons. He doesn't care what table you sit at, what group you're from. Listen, when you call upon the name of the Lord, He will use you. He's strategically placing you amongst people and around others so that you can testify to His goodness and His grace. That's what we see here. What an unlikely person to save, though. If I was God, I'd want to save all the best-looking, smartest people. So would you. You know how I know? Because they're all your idols. The best singer, the best looking, the one who's got the most money. And we idolize them. And that's who we'd save. That isn't how God works. He places Mordecai in this place to save an wretched, unworthy king. But what we don't know, and what we'll find out, is that activity will be used to save God's people. I find some things very interesting, maybe even peculiar here when we look at this text, is that Ahasuerus was historically known for blessing those who, and we see it later, what he does for Mordecai, bestowing on them lavish blessings, those who've come to his aid or stood beside him and were loyal. But did you notice the text? It's written in the king's book, but the king forgets. He forgets. This is strange, and it should catch our attention in the narrative. We see him not being rewarded. The facts are written in the king's book, and the king doesn't remember it. And then we move right along. trying to run as fast as we can to chapter 4, verse 14. We don't realize the whole story's been set up right here. Right here's the crux that will propel us to chapter 6. We're being set up to told that Ahasuerus, the greatest man living, who has no limits, he has whatever he wants, his own desires, his will, but he forgets the man who saved his life. Can you imagine how disappointing it is when someone forgets about you? You ever been there? Why didn't they call? Why didn't they check on me? Why didn't they look in on me? Remember Joseph? Remember his story? He had done for others, but they forgot about him. We're hearing that narrative again, are we not, in the back of our minds? God's people strategically placed, saving others, and they forget about the ones who saved them. They forget about the ones who stood in the gap, but here's the good news this morning. We will discover quickly that although Ahasuerus forgot all about Mordecai, God didn't. In fact, God didn't even need to write it in a book because he knows everything. He knew exactly what was going on. He doesn't need to be reminded because he's the one who providentially and strategically placed Mordecai right where he was. God doesn't have to write you in on his calendar. He doesn't have to write himself a reminder note. I was sharing with the college kids the other day, the Bible says, and God remembered Noah. God uses words so that we'd understand his character and his person. It's not like he forgot about him. Can you imagine that? God tells Noah, I'm going to flood the earth, build a boat, get on it. Whoops, I forgot. Maybe that was more water than I intended. I don't know. But he comes back to him like, whoa, stop. Noah, are you okay? No, he hasn't forgotten. We understand something about God's character is that God always sees everything at every moment perfectly, vividly. Every single detail of your life is before God. He's visibly seeing it. He's aware of it. Nothing has caught him off guard. He's surprised by nothing. He has forgotten nothing. I want you to understand something today. The world may forget you, but God never does because you are his own. Never will he forget you. Never is there a moment when his eyes, his gaze of grace isn't upon you. It will feel like that sometimes. You will feel lonely and alone. Saying, God, where are you? He hasn't left you. He hasn't forsaken you. He hasn't abandoned you. That is what Jesus promised. He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. There's never a moment in your temporal existence where God has forgotten about you. He knows your pain and your anguish and your anxiety and your despair. He is well acquainted and understands your fear this morning. You say, he doesn't understand my fear. Jesus was like us in every way but without sin. And I remember when he prayed in the garden, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But not my will, thine be done. God is well aware of your situation. He understands your anguish and he knows your broken heart. He has not and he will not forget you. Never, never will he forget you. It's interesting. Some of you came here today feeling insignificant. You came here feeling like your life didn't matter. You felt that you were of little importance. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm not saying that because of who you are. No. No, sir. No, ma'am. I'm saying that because of who he is. The cross wasn't an afterthought, and it wasn't an accident. It was God's display of mercy, love, and grace to you. You matter so much that he gave his life for you. And he has brought you here today to hear that He hasn't forgotten you. Oh, there are some of you here today who, because sin has pulled you away, at times you have forgotten God. And sometimes you want to forget God. But this is the thing about grace. While you forget and while you try to forget, He doesn't. He knows exactly where you are, and He's bringing that grace to you through the gospel of Jesus Christ. You are here today by divine appointment. Therefore, call upon the name of the Lord. Let us pray.